Good evening and welcome to the 18th of January 2021 meeting of the Licensing and General Purposes Committee. My name is Councillor Meir and I'm Chairman of the committee. This meeting is being held remotely, is being live streamed via YouTube, and the recording of it will be available afterwards on our website. Councillors and officers are reminded to put their mobile phone on silent if they have one near them, and mute your microphones when not speaking, as this will reduce feedback and background noise and saves bandwidth to prevent loss of connection. If you are a member of the committee, please leave your camera on. I will first do a roll call to check all the committee members who are expected to attend are present. As I say your name, please turn on your microphone and confirm that you are connected. Councillor Bird.
Present.
Councillor Brown.
Present.
Councillor Byrne.
Present.
Councillor Coleman.
Present.
Councillor Curtis.
Present.
Councillor Drayson.
Present.
Councillor Field.
Present.
Councillor Harmer.
Present.
Councillor Maidley.
Present.
Councillor Thomas.
Present.
Councillor Timpey.
Present.
If there is any other member joining us today, could I ask you please to type your name in the chat facility now so that I and Louise, our clerk, can note that you are here. And we have Councillor Doug Oliver, Councillor Jeanette Stevens, Councillor Kevin Dixon, Councillor Polly Gray, and I think that is all. If I've missed anybody, please shout out. Right. Officers joining us today are Malcolm Johnston, our Chief Executive, Robin Venard, Assistant Director of Resources, Richard Parker Harding, Head of Service Environmental Services, Licensing and Community Safety, and Andy Eaton, the Deputy Legal Services Manager. The Democratic Services Officer, that is to say our committee clerk, is Louise Hollingsworth. Members of the committee will be taking decisions today by a named vote. Louise will call out each member in turn, and you will either answer for or against or abstain. Members, please remember to turn on your microphones again at this point, and please turn off again after voting. I think we all know by now there can be a delay of about 5 seconds between unmuting your microphone and it going live. Members wishing to speak, please enter your name only in the chat facility. Each item will be reintroduced as we get to it. And we then move to agenda item 1, which is to resolve that the minutes of the last meeting be confirmed as a correct record of the proceedings to be signed by the chairman, that's me, at a later date. Are we all agreed?
Agreed.
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 Agreed, Chair.
In the absence of objections, we do not need to take a recorded vote on this, and so that is carried. Item 2, apologies for absence and substitutes. I'm told, Louise, that Councillor Hart has sent her apologies.
That's right, Chairman, and also Councillor Mrs. Earl Williams.
And Councillor Mrs. Earl Williams, thank you very much. Are there any additional agenda items?
Not
No?
received.
Thank you. Agenda item 4, disclosure of interests. Members, please type your name into the chat to indicate that you wish to speak. Please state clearly if you have a personal and prejudicial interest in the agenda and say which item it refers to. And I don't see anything in the chat. So no disclosures. Which brings us on to the substantive matters. Agenda item number 5, which is the surveillance activity annual update. And I think who will be speaking to this? Is it Andy Eaton or is it Malcolm Johnson?
I'm quite happy to lead Chair on this particular one. It's a fairly simple report. I think most members will have seen this report last year, and you'll probably see it next year. In as far as we are required as part of our ongoing RIPA strategy, that we have to give an annual report to members just to show you what our covert activity has been through that preceding year, and anything which has happened about RIPA during that particular year. So as this report sets out, during 2020, we were inspected by the Commissioner. That normally happens every 2 to 3 years, and this, because of the COVID issue, that was done via I had to send all the documentation through to the Commissioner to have a look at, and then we had a long interview on the Teams during the latter part of May. We successfully got through that particular inspection, notwithstanding the fact that we haven't carried out any directed covert surveillance since 2015. It is something which is in our weaponry for investigations, and accordingly we can be called upon to use it where it's absolutely necessary, and there is no other alternative than to use covert surveillance. But notwithstanding that, obviously the inspector still has to look through the documentation and make sure that he's happy. We had carried out some significant amount of training in 2019. That is an ongoing obligation. We'll have to do more training probably next year when hopefully things get a little bit back to normal, because our authorising officers and our investigators all have to be regularly trained. And one of the recommendations under the Commissioner's report was that ongoing training should be logged. There were 1 or 2 minor changes to the report, just in terminology, in relation to our covert activity. Should we use social media? There was some extra paragraphs put in there. But other than that, the report really sets out the fact that that report was successful. We haven't used our powers in 2020. Just as a reminder to members, this only relates to covert activity. This isn't our normal overt investigatory techniques which we use in planning and benefit fraud, etc. This is only where we are using these covert methods. But unless members have got any questions, that really is a summary of the report. And again, the report is there simply for noting for this year. And again, it will be a feature in next January's LNGP committee, where we'll give you a summary of what activity we've carried out this year.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of members wishing to speak or to ask questions, and the first one is Councillor Field.
Yes, thank you. Andy has partially answered my question, because I remember at last year's meeting in January a very long discussion about social media and how we should monitor it, and if we should monitor it, and what counted as covert and what counted as overt. I'm still not quite sure how you distinguish between covert and overt when it comes to social media monitoring. But given the fact that so many people have been locked down in or out, or whatever you might like to call it, this last year, I would have thought social media activity was rather heavier than normally is the case. And I wondered how that had impacted on your work.
Well, certainly there have been no requests for the use of RIPA powers in relation to any covert activity which we carry out on social media. In that context, Councillor, probably if you could sort of think in terms of the fact that, were it the case, and I don't suggest that it is, but were it the case that any form of false identity was used in order to use information which is out on the internet by befriending people who are on Facebook, by using a false identity. Any activity of that kind would have to be covered by RIPA authorization, and we simply don't operate to those extents because of the firm policy which we have in place and because of the restrictions which are there to protect it. But that doesn't mean to say that officers are not entitled, and they do occasionally look at Facebook as a first blush by means of access into an investigation, and that does that is carried out, but that's only on publicly available information through all forms of social media.
Thank you. Does that answer your question?
Well, it answers the question, but it doesn't really get to the bottom of what I don't understand, which really is, have we got the technical skills to access the internet in a covert way?
Yes, we have them, but you can't use them unless you have an authorization from a senior officer, and Malcolm and Robin are two of them. From, I think, Ben, Hook, and I think Joe are also authorizing officers. It needs an authorization initially at that level, and furthermore, it needs a magistrate's court approval for the use of that activity, where we are attempting to befriend anybody through social media in order to glean information from them.
That I can understand what you're saying. If we were bothered about something we'd noticed by people in reality doing something, how do you know whether or not you need permission to have a covert operation if you're not monitoring covertly to start off with? Because you don't know what you don't know, do you? And that's my end of my contribution.
Right, your only access initially for an officer is just looking at, on a first blush, information which is in a public domain. If that leads an officer to feel that there is a further need for more investigatory work in relation to anything they've found, it then moves into a RIPA consideration as to whether or not an authorization should be granted. But initial first blush looking at certain aspects of Facebook are not covered by RIPA, but where it leads to an investigation, it would be.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor Byrne.
Thank you, Andrew. My question was really around the same area, and your answer to Catherine has answered many of the things I was going to ask. However, paragraph 3A says the council's policy needed to be updated to cover the surveillance of social media. Has it been updated, and where is it published?
Well, we're making a number of changes at the moment to the existing policy, because we've had some changes in personnel as well, because obviously we've lost some of our authorising officers, and that's got to be incorporated into it. Policy currently is published, and our sections on that are within the social media sections within the policy. But there are some ongoing changes which need to be made, because overall we have to relook at our authorising officer situation so we can keep it up to date.
So when that's been finalised, will that come back to us again?
It can do if you want it to. It wouldn't normally, because the policy stands alone and it's there for inspection at any time anybody wants to go and have a look at our policy. But certainly, if members would like to see it in the future, then I'm sure that we could. I'm looking at Malcolm, but I mean, ultimately, I can't see any problem in bringing that policy forward if you wanted to have a look at it. But it is currently out there. But it has to be updated, because in recent times we've lost some of our authorising officers.
Okay, because I was thinking of Catherine's issue as well, which is, we are all exposed to social media a lot, more than we ever were before. We all spot things, and it would be good to know exactly which side of that line it was, and whether we were making a mountain out of a molehill by reporting something, or whether it was completely okay, or whether it was something that it's likely you would already have picked up. So social media is so all pervasive now that I think we probably all need to know a lot more about the policy than we did maybe even just a year ago.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can talk to Malcolm in terms of when we can bring that back with an update of the report.
Well, maybe just a digest for members.
I think Malcolm Johnson would like to say something at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Andy. We can bring a report back, but yeah, I think the point is, and Andy will correct me if I'm wrong, you may, while surfing various forms of social media, and bear in mind Facebook isn't the only one, come across something that you think, oh, what's this about? At that point, that's fine. It's when you suddenly say, we need to look at this further, and actually then we say, well, actually, how do we look at it further? I think I'm right, Andy, in saying that. So actually, browsing social media is not an offence in itself, because that's what we all do. It's when you decide to take it a stage further. And at that point, all our, as Andy says, all our officers have been trained that there's a procedure that then kicks in to deal with that. I think, to take Councillor Field's point, it would be worth bringing it back to this committee, if for no other reason than just to remind us all, officers included, of the procedures that we must follow. Because one of the things that the surveillance commissioner is particularly interested in is sometimes when you decided not to use your RIPA powers, as well as the times that if you decided to use them. And I mean, I think, just to reassure members, there is an awful lot we do overtly, environmental health food inspections, for instance, things like that, and we will continue to use those means. We haven't seen a need to use it for a number of years, but it is a weapon, if you like to use that expression, in our armoury that we can use. But I'm very happy to bring it back with the changes to this committee, Chairman.
Well, and thank you. And would it be possible to have a link to the policy? I think members might like to see that.
Sorry, I didn't get time while I was talking or to do the same. I can't do two things at one time, as Councillor Field will know. So I will provide that link to the policy. Yes.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. Thank you. I don't see anybody else indicating that they wish to speak. In which case, the report is for noting, I think, so that we don't need to take a vote on it. But we do note the report, and thank you very much, Andy and Malcolm, for your help on that. We then have agenda item number 6, which are fees and charges, and I think that Richard Parker Harding will be speaking to this. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this is the annual report we make to set the fees from the 1st of April. And obviously the report is in the report has 3 sections in the appendix. Appendix A sets out the fees which are discretionary and the function of this committee. Appendix B are those fees which have to be set by the executive, so they have already been set by cabinet. And Appendix C sets out the statutory fees where we have no discretion, and those are the fees under the Licensing Act 2003 and Gambling Act 2005, which are set by statute, which we've got no ability to change. Unfortunately, those fees have not been increased by government since 2005, and therefore some of them are very low. When looking at the fees, it's important to bear in mind that the fees should be set in such a way as to cover our costs. We're not allowed to make a profit. We are allowed to cover our costs. And obviously, if we reduce our fees below our costs, that would then mean that expenditure which we incur would have to be paid for out of the General Council taxation. The only other issue to members should be aware of is that although the fees cover the costs of enforcement of licensing conditions, they don't cover the cost of investigating unlicensed activities. That has to be borne by the council tax. So in this report, we are only recommending 2 increases in fees. One for increase in fees of £10 for home boarding, and secondly to increase the administration charge which we impose if a driver or vehicle operator submits an application for a taxi licence for a driver or vehicle and then withdraws that application after we've carried out works in processing the application. So that's my introduction. Thank you, Chairman.
And they're very, very small increases too, aren't they? But they're very small increases.
Yes. Pounds.
Well, I do have a couple of councillors wishing to ask questions. If I work this machine. And the first is Councillor Byrne, please.
Thank you, Andrew. Actually, Richard, you've answered the general thrust of my question, which was the policy implications. And as you say, we are only allowed to cover our administrative costs. So does that really mean that there is no strategic element to this, as I was alluding to before the meeting, in terms of encouraging some things and discouraging others? Does that just come completely outside this policy?
It would be dangerous to do that, because obviously we could then be challenged if you were sort of using one fee to subsidise another activity. Then obviously you could then be challenged as to why you were doing that. What we try and do is to try and make sure that the fees we charge reflect the actual work that is involved in administering that particular licence.
Okay, no, that's absolutely fine. That's fine.
Perhaps if I could just interject quickly, I mean, to make that clear from Richard's point of view, one of the leading cases recently on discretionary fees was one involving sex shops. It was the case of Hemming. And what Westminster City Council used to do is to make the fee for an annual sex shop licence extremely excessive. It was £30,000 just to renew a licence, and they were using that money to assist the council in enforcing against unlicensed sex shops. The case went all the way to the European Court, and the ruling which came out, which was that local authorities are not allowed to set fees which are to discourage the opening of sex shops. The European Court was clear that any licence fee can only reflect the actual cost of issuing that licence and a modest amount of money for the enforcement of the conditions of that licence. But it's certainly forbidden from using licence fees to openly discourage the use of that licence, because under the European rules, there should be unfettered access to those licences for a fee which is a reasonable fee. And unfortunately, in Westminster's case, they lost an awful lot of money in that, because they had to refund an awful lot of the sex shop fees. That might help you understand that particular point.
Yes, it does, and thank you. As I say, that really covers most of the unease I had about this whole procedure when I saw this massive amount of licenses, and I thought, well, we've not really spoken about these in any tactical terms, but as you say, that doesn't come into this at all. It's outside the scope of this committee, which is fine. My other small point is, why would anyone withdraw an application?
Well,
I'm talking about taxis.
Sometimes people put an application in, and then because something happens, like some criminal conviction is discovered, which means it's unlikely they're going to go ahead, then they withdraw. But by which time we've already done quite a lot of work. We probably that we want to cover some of our costs.
So that does really discourage anyone who feels they may be trying to hide something. It discourages them right from the start. Okay, yes. That's absolutely fine. Thank you for that, Richard.
Thank you. Councillor Field.
Yes, thank you. I mean, as always, this report, as Councillor Byrne has said, highlights the huge amount of work the licensing officers do and the huge array of knowledge they have to have, because it goes from sex shops to taxis to dogs and everything in between. It's quite phenomenal. But I'm inferring from what you said then that the cost that we charge has to reflect the cost of each individual licence, not the cost of the service overall, which is a shame, I think. Where we're not increasing costs, is that because those services already cover their costs, or because we choose not to? Because, of course, every time that we don't cover our costs, it's easy to say the taxpayer is covering it for us, but actually it's all of us individually subsidising services we might not really want to. You said also there was room for a modest sum for enforcement, which I think gives a bit of scope for how we charge for these things. And then you said the Westminster Court case went to the European Court. Well, as we no longer belong to the EU, do we have to take notice of what the European Court said historically? Thank you.
Just on that legal point, Richard, you do deal with the rest, but before it got to the European Court, it had to go through the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found in the same way that the European Court found, and we are bound by the Supreme Court's decision on Hemming, yes. But Richard, do you want to answer the other bits?
In terms of the costs of issuing license on our database, we record all the time we spend on each license, and obviously it does average over. So obviously some licenses take much longer than others, but on average, the time it takes to issue a license is what's reflected in the fees. I mean, it is obviously something we need to constantly review every year, but there's nothing dramatically has happened, which means that the fees can be increased dramatically. And obviously, in some ways, because we are improving the technology, we're obviously always trying to move things onto online application forms and reducing the amount of time spent in the back office. In fact, we sort of reduce our costs, which means that we can't then increase our fees. It's always difficult with licensing because you can we try and obviously improve efficiencies and improve people filling in online forms on our drive to digital. But in fact, all that really means is that we're reducing our costs, which means we can't then increase our fees.
Thank you. Councillor Harmer.
Thank you, Chair. Pretty much most of my questions have been asked and answered very well. Just an observation really how sad it is to look at this list of businesses that obviously have to pay for service, which is a statutory obligation, when they can't trade, like myself. But we have got the business fund, and that definitely helps towards the outgoings. So yeah, just an observation of how very sad it is, really. Thanks.
Yes.
Well, thank you. Right, I think that no one else is indicating to speak. Councillor Coleman, you wish to move acceptance?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just wish to move the recommendation that the report be resolved as set out.
Do we have a seconder for that? Is there a seconder?
I'm happy to second.
Councillor Byrne seconds. I think we have to take a vote on this, Louise.
Yes, please. Thank you, Chairman.
Will you do that?
Yes, I will do. Members, I'll call your names out alphabetically. Please respond with for, against or abstain. Councillor Bird.
For.
Councillor Brown.
For.
Councillor Byrne.
For.
Councillor Coleman.
For.
Councillor Curtis.
For.
Councillor Field.
For.
Councillor Harmer.
For.
Councillor Madeley.
For.
Councillor Mear.
For.
Councillor Thomas.
For.
And Councillor Tempe.
For.
That's carried, Chairman. Thank you very much. And the next matter is, of course, agenda item number 7, to consider the Council's licensing policy. And again, will this be Mr. Parker Harding?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. We have to adopt a licensing policy under the Licensing Act 2003. We need to have a current policy to deal with licensing applications under the Act, and also to deal with any reviews which come in under the Act. It's under the Licensing Act 2003, the licensing policies have to be reviewed every 5 years. So this policy has not actually changed substantially since 2005, and it is not proposed this time to make any substantial changes to the policy. We did consult the responsible authorities, the police, East Sussex Fire and Rescue Service, training standards, and also the Director of Public Health, whether they wish to make any changes to the existing policy, and they didn't indicate they wish to make any changes. and therefore we did not carry out public consultation because we're not required to do so unless we're making any substantial changes. The policy itself is limited to covering the 4 licensing objectives. So it can only cover prevention of crime and disorder, public safety, prevention of public nuisance, and the protection of children from harm. And that within the policy, we have different sections that cover those 4 licensing objectives. And that's my introduction. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I know that Councillor Drayson wishes to raise some matters on the various typos and drafting matters. Councillor Drayson.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'm only going to raise a couple of points now. My main thing is I see nothing wrong with the policy. I think it will achieve its purpose. It just seems that it's not been proofread or read in detail, and that there are some typos in there. But I'm going to just pick out a couple of sentences, and then I'll suggest a way forward. In the section headed Operating Schedule at the bottom of big page 25, there is a sentence that reads, "The Act requires an operating scheme which is set out steps which an applicant of a premises licence proposes to take in order to work licensing objectives." I will leave members to ponder on what that sentence actually means. I think there is a sensible point in that, but that's gobbledygook. It makes no sense. And on big page 41 at the bottom, the last sentence reads, "However, if there are good reasons for restricting those hours, for example, where police representations are made in respect of shops known to be the focus of disorder and disturbance, or underage sales have been made at certain times," seems to just stop. There's no verb in that sentence to make it a sentence. It isn't saying what we're going to do. And in fact, there's no reference to hours in the rest of that section. So it's almost an orphan stuck in the middle of nowhere. So whilst I say I have got no problems with the policy, and I hope we can approve it tonight, but I hope between now and February Council, Mr. Parker Harding or Andy Heaton and a couple of people can get together and get rid of all the typos in it. And it won't change the meaning, it will just change the way it reads. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, and I have the observation that these errors, if they are indeed errors, have been carried forward from the version approved by this committee in 2016 and probably from the one in 2005 also, but I didn't check that far back. Does any other councillor wish to speak? I don't see anybody indicating. If so, would anyone wish to propose? Yes, Councillor Coleman would wish to propose, subject to the matter being looked at by the Chief Executive before being brought forward to full council.
I have to second, Chair.
And we have a second from Councillor Harmer. And no.
For.
Councillor Brown.
For.
Councillor Byrne.
For.
Councillor Coleman.
For.
Councillor Curtis.
For.
Councillor Field.
For.
Councillor Harmer.
For.
Councillor Madeley.
For.
Councillor Mear.
For.
Councillor Thomas.
For.
And Councillor Tempe.
For.
That's carried, Chairman.
Thank you, Louise, and I think that concludes the business of the committee for this evening. Which is very, very brisk. Thank you all very much, and the time is now 7:05, and I then formally close the meeting. Thank you.